All right, I'd like to welcome everyone who is watching this conversation about the COVID vaccine. And this is a conversation that spurred out of a meeting with the Vaccine Task Force of Manitoba and then the Steinbach and area ministerial just a few weeks ago. During that time, these pastors were able to bring forward a lot of questions that they would have and their congregations would have, and found a lot of really good answers in return. And so we want to expand this conversation to the entire faith community of Southern Manitoba and all of the province. So my name is Andrew Dick. I am the senior pastor at Stony Brook Fellowship here in Steinbach, and I am participating on behalf of the Steinbach and area ministerial.
And my name is Gerald Dick. I'm a pastor at Westside Community Church in Morden, and part of the Morden Ministerial, and looking forward to the conversation, and really want to thank Dr. Reimer for taking the time and doing this with us. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to the conversations.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm Joss Reimer, the medical lead for the Vaccine Implementation Task Force for the province, originally from the Winkler area, but living in Winnipeg now. So very happy to hopefully answer questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Reimer. We know that you obviously have a lot on your plate. And so again, we do appreciate the time that you've given for this. And so we've had the opportunity to talk to some of the other churches and church members in our area. And so we've compiled a list of some of the common questions that we have heard. And we're just wanting to put those forward to you and see how you can maybe help answer some of these things and give some very helpful information as people continue to decide about the vaccination for themselves. So the first question that I would have for you is the fact that the COVID-19 vaccines were approved in record time. Much has been made of how fast that they came out. And this has caused, I think, some very understandable hesitancy of people who feel maybe it was too fast, or maybe some steps were skipped, and is this still experimental in such a way it's even only approved on an emergency use. So my question to you is, given this record time, what can you say about the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine? Were any important steps skipped in order to make it available to us this quickly?
Yeah, that's a great question, because things did happen very quickly compared to what we usually see for vaccine development. But the first thing I'd say is that mRNA, or messenger RNA technology, is not new. This is something that Moderna, for example, has been working on for over a decade. And it's been in the science community for several decades. And there are treatments for cancer that use mRNA. There are other vaccines that use mRNA. But this is the first time that we've used it in a big public vaccine campaign. So it's certainly the first time that most people are hearing about it. And so, it can feel very strange and new and scary because this is the first time any of us have heard of it. But I also want to reassure people that we didn't skip any steps. So the reason things happened so quickly is two separate things. One is that the companies were able to build on their existing knowledge of mRNA. So Moderna, for example, already had an influenza vaccine that was mRNA. So they were able to use the platform they already had and just had to tailor the actual messaging in it to be COVID specific instead of influenza. So that helped them move fairly quickly. And then the second thing is that the whole world was working on this together at the same time. Usually companies and researchers and approval bodies are working on so many different things at the same time to get different medications and treatments and vaccines created and approved. But instead, we all basically took all of our expertise around the world and focused them on this one thing. And it really showed how much we can do when we all come together on the same thing. It was so encouraging to watch all of this happen so quickly. And even at Health Canada, instead of approving tons of different things, they really focused in on COVID and used their resources to carefully go through all of the material that was submitted to them, but doing it on a priority basis. So they went through things a lot faster than they usually would, but not less carefully. They just took more people and more time and bumped it to the front of the line of what they were working on, because obviously we all want to get out of this as quickly as we can, and Health Canada is no different. So they still required them to do all the same studies as usual. They just did their review sooner than they normally would be able to. It would have been put into the queue along with other reviews.
Thank you for that. I think we're going to pinball back and forth, but between asking questions. One of the questions that comes up is the vaccine safe for pregnant women? Is it safe for the child they're carrying? What would your response be to that question?
Yeah, I get that one a lot, as well as, does it impact fertility? So people even who aren't pregnant worried that it might impact their ability to become pregnant in the future. And we have used over 1.5 billion doses around the world so far, and haven't seen any complications related to pregnancy, fertility, breastfeeding, not for the person who's pregnant and not for the baby. So it's been really encouraging to see that not one country has reported any concerns about that. And so where the fertility thing came from originally, I'm not sure, but we aren't seeing any problems anywhere. There was a trial in the US that looked specifically at the vaccine during pregnancy, and they found there was no increase in miscarriage, no increase in early birth, no increase in stillbirth, no increase in birth defects, nothing concerning. One of the positives, though, is that there is the possibility, and we're still trying to figure out how strong this is, but that if you get a vaccine when you're pregnant, the antibodies, that army of fighters that your body builds up to the vaccine, can go through the placenta to the baby, which means after the baby's born, it will have a little bit of an ability to fight the virus itself, just because it's got those antibodies that were fed to it when it was still inside. And so we don't have a lot of evidence yet about COVID specifically, but we do have good evidence from influenza and whooping cough that show us that this does happen and provides benefit to the baby. So, theoretically, we could see benefit here, and the early studies are showing that it's looking like that direction. Now, what the thing that's always the biggest challenge is that the original trials, they always exclude people who are pregnant. And, I do a prenatal clinic, so this is a conversation I have to have with people about Tylenol, about their heartburn medication, about everything, because we always exclude pregnant people from every trial. And so we have to use the real world information from the post-manufacturing data instead of the original trial data to help us make those decisions. And this is the same thing. They weren't included in the original trial, but now that we've given out over 1.5 billion doses, we're seeing that no safety concerns are popping up anywhere related to pregnancy.
Well, thank you. That's I think, really appropriate to point out that we are now dealing not with clinical trials, but real world data coming back at us. My next question did have something to do with infertility. I think you've already answered that in your original question. So just a spin-off of this concern from those who are pregnant. You say that there's a lot of information coming back that pregnancy isn't at risk with the vaccine. What have we seen COVID do for those pregnant women who have come down with the virus itself?
That's a really good point, because while the vaccine so far appears to be safe in pregnancy and not linked to anything concerning, COVID is not the same thing. So, pregnant individuals are not more likely to get infected, but they are more likely to get really sick if they do. So we know that in pregnancy, our immune system gets weakened a little bit, which is actually a really good thing, because we don't want people to attack their own baby, because the baby has foreign DNA and things that your body might respond to if our immune system wasn't quieted down a little bit. And so we can see that people, because of that, can get more sick when they do get infected with things like COVID. So we're seeing that compared to the general population in pregnancy, people are more likely to end up in the ICU, and they're more likely to have to deliver the baby early, which can have lifelong complications for that baby as well. So, it's not one of the highest risk things. Certainly things like severe kidney disease are a higher risk for those severe complications, but it is still higher than the general population. And then we also have to think about the potential that that baby could have lifelong complications if it's born early or gets infected early on.
Thank you. How important is it for youth under the age of, let's say, 18 to get vaccinated?
So it's an interesting question because we talk all about how kids are less likely to get really sick. And so people feel like, maybe we shouldn't be giving a vaccine to somebody if the illness isn't going to be severe. And I think that that's true for most kids, that they won't get really sick, but it's not true for all of them. So we are still seeing children end up in the hospital. We are still seeing some children die. We've had children die in Manitoba. And so it's not zero risk. And so we really do want to protect those children as well from those severe consequences. And we're seeing something called long COVID, which is when people end up having symptoms for months on end. And that also seems to be happening in kids as well, where they're not severely ill necessarily, not in the hospital, but they just kind of get short of breath all the time for months on end. So they can't play sports anymore. They're having trouble in gym class. It's hard for them to carry their backpack to school and back. And so, I want to prevent all of those things. I don't want to see any kids ending up not being able to play soccer. I certainly don't want to see any of them in the hospital. And on top of that, I don't want them being the reason that their grandma got infected and ended up in the hospital. And so it's really important that we think of this as a family approach and that we can all protect each other. And especially with these vaccines being so low risk of any complications, especially compared to COVID, I really do recommend that kids get vaccinated for themselves and for their families, and so they can get back to school.
Excellent. Yeah, and I know the youth of our province are excited about all of those things as well. One of the main questions that I hear as a pastor coming from the congregations that I'm a part of and around is an ethical one. So of all the COVID vaccines that have been approved for use in Canada, do any of them use material from aborted fetuses?
So none of them have any material from aborted fetuses in them. I think a lot of the concern about that came from some research that happened in the 1970s, where they used some fetal kidney cells as a way to do some research, and some of that contributed to vaccine research as well. And that has stuck around and been something that's been problematic for people and has been over interpreted and applied to situations where it's not actually being used anymore for decades. So these vaccines don't have any fetal material in them. In fact, they don't even have any virus in them. So nothing live in them at all. But certainly, understanding that research did back in the 70s include some fetal cells and went towards a lot of different treatments. So some of the other medications and things that we use today also came out of that original research. So it's not unique to vaccines by any stretch, but also not something that people should worry about with these vaccines today.
So one of the questions that does come up quite often is this: it's a personal choice. People are perhaps not worried about how sick they will get. They feel they're healthy, they weather it, build up antibodies. It's kind of the natural path that we need to follow here. So the personal choice, the lack of concern about their own health, the feeling they will be okay. What are the possible benefits to the rest of the community that person or that community would experience through those people being vaccinated? What would your answer be to them?
Yeah, and what's great news is that most people don't end up in the hospital. Most people don't die when they get COVID, which overall is really wonderful. But the downside of that is that because most people don't end up in the hospital, it spreads more. For something like Ebola, for example, it kills people so quickly that it can't spread nearly as easily, and we don't end up with these huge global pandemics of it because it just can't go from person to person. People are so sick so fast, it's very obvious, and so that doesn't happen. So you end up with fewer deaths overall, even though the virus itself is really dangerous. So where I like to think about this one is that, for many of us, it's not about me necessarily. Now, I don't think I would end up in the hospital if I got COVID. But to me, it's really important that I don't contribute to anybody else ending up in the hospital. I think it's a really wonderful way to show love for your family and for your community, that even if you don't think that you'd end up in the hospital, that you'd still take that personal choice to do this, to protect the people that could end up in the hospital. Or maybe it's not somebody that you're in direct contact with, but you spread it to someone else, and now they spread it to someone who ends up in the hospital. So, I think it's a wonderful way for communities to support each other. And that's, even all of that aside, this is going to be the best way to get rid of all these public health restrictions that we hate. None of us want to be stuck at home. The weather is so wonderful right now. I think we'd love to go to the beach with our friends and be able to spend time at a picnic with family. And the sooner that we can get more people immunized, the sooner we can do all of those things together. There's already some benefits for individuals. If you are a close contact to a case, but you've had your 2 vaccines, you're not going to be required to self-isolate. So that's already a benefit for people who are vaccinated, and those are going to grow. So let's, I really want us to all do this together, even though most of us won't end up in the hospital, but we don't know who will. And we have had some young and healthy people end up in the hospital, and I don't want to see anybody be in that circumstance.
No, absolutely. And I think it is really great to take this idea of what can we do to show love to those around us. And I know that's of the utmost importance to many Manitobans and especially the faith community as well. The next question that I have for you, Dr. Reimer, is one that's probably most specific to the Christian community, and just worry about any type of markings or tracks or anything like that. So does any of these COVID-19 vaccines include a marker or biometric tracking of any kind?
Absolutely not. So what's in the vaccine is just something called messenger RNA, which is basically like a little recipe card that temporarily tells your cells to make a protein. And that's it. There's nothing else in there that can be tracked. There's nothing in there that stays in you for good. That messenger RNA gets gobbled up by your body and destroyed fairly quickly. So there's no way that this can do anything other than just create an immune response to this virus. So yeah, absolutely 100% no tracking device of any type in these vaccines.
And I appreciate that clarity too. I just have one maybe addendum to that, and this is something that I read. So this is my ignorance coming forward a bit, but I know that I believe there was a study at MIT that is looking at doing vaccine records by tagging with invisible ink on the skin so that somebody could come by later and look at that marking and see who's been vaccinated for what. That wouldn't be part of the vaccine itself, but still a mark that would be left with somebody. Is that's also not in use with these COVID vaccines?
So we are not doing anything like that and have no intentions of doing anything like that here. The only record keeping here is the same as all other parts of your health record. So when you go to the hospital and you have blood tests done, that all becomes part of your health record, so that the next time you go to the hospital, they can see that, oh, this person has diabetes. We need to be really careful about making sure they get the right amount of insulin, for example. So your health record gets updated so that your doctor can see what you've received or not received, but that's it. There's no other mechanism for us to track. We can't look at anybody and know whether or not they got the vaccine. We are not tattooing anybody. It's just, like the influenza vaccine, it's a needle in the arm, and that's it.
Thank you.
If someone has already had COVID, do they need to get a vaccine? Or if they think they've had COVID, perhaps?
Well, if you think you have, I'd say for sure, yes, because you don't know for sure if you've had COVID, and a lot of other viruses can give similar symptoms. Influenza can do that. Rhinovirus, which is like the common cold virus, can give you similar symptoms. So if you don't know for sure, then I would say let's be sure. If you for sure have been infected, you probably are immune at least for a little while. We have seen that people are unlikely to get a second infection for the first 3 months after they get the vaccine. But as these variants are appearing, it does seem like people are more risk of getting a second infection with a new type of the virus. And so far, the vaccines seem to be working quite well, even against the variants. So I do recommend that, even if you've had the infection, getting the vaccine does two things. One is it probably expands how many types of this virus you'd be immune to. And the second is it prolongs how long you'll be immune. So we don't know how long people stay immune after the infection, but this will certainly boost your immunity. So get your immune system even stronger so that when it comes to the fall, we're not having to shut everything down again. And we know that most people are immune. And then finally, some people are not going to be immune, even if they get infected. Some of us, for some reason or another, our immune system just doesn't quite create the same response. And there's no way to know which people did get that really strong response and which ones didn't. And so that's the reason that we do 2 doses, is because we don't know for sure after the first dose which are the unlucky people who didn't respond very well. And that's also why you should get a vaccine after an infection, because you don't know if you might be one of those people who is not immune. So a couple good reasons to do it. But we're going to be watching this too as we go forward. And if we start to see that the infection itself is good enough, we're not going to keep recommending it. But for now, we don't have any way to guarantee that you're immune after you've had the infection.
Thanks for that answer as well. One of the real challenges that we've all found with COVID and the vaccines is access to the appropriate and helpful information. And I know you can find information out there. You can find a lot of people with different credentials that will put out videos and sign letters. And so one of the things that I've encouraged my people to do as a pastor is to just talk to their own doctor and to try to keep the information that we find with local physicians who really have our best interest in mind and have Manitoba's best interest in mind. So with that clarification, do you know of any medical professionals in Manitoba that are actively endorsing not getting the vaccine?
Yeah, so we have about 3,000 doctors in Manitoba, and I'm not aware of any of them that are telling people not to get the vaccine. So, I mean, it's certainly possible that there are individuals that I'm not aware of, but I haven't even heard of one physician who's saying not to do it. And in Canada, we have about 95,000 doctors, and I've only heard of 2 or 3 in the whole country that are saying not to do it. But their voices get amplified a lot and get presented as a reasonable alternative. And so people start to see it as, well, this doctor says to get it, but this one says not to, when in fact it's like 94,990 doctors say to get it and 10 say not to. But that's not the way social media or even the traditional media works. They really do present them as 2 equally valid options. So I do think it's a really great idea to talk to the doctors who work in your local communities, because not only do they know about the vaccine, they know about the community, they know about you, they know about your health, and they can help work through the individual concerns that you might have. So we've, my dad's a doctor in Southern Manitoba, so I've spent my whole life watching the way he interacts with his patients and the way he participates in the community. And so I think that's a great idea, to talk to the local doctors who can provide you that trusted voice, more than someone like me who most people have never met.
With new technology, or feels like to us it's new technology, are there any concerns for long-term side effects? Like you hear about proteins, elevated proteins. You hear that about the fear of it can change our DNA. What would your response be to those questions?
Yeah, so we are not aware of any long-term problems with this or any other vaccine for that matter. Certainly, we know that some vaccines can have long-term consequences of things that happen right away. So, people can get syndromes that appear right away and can last for a long time after they get a vaccine. But none of the vaccines that we have seem to just cause problems later in life, like crop up later on. And that's the same for this one, as far as we've seen so far. There may be, a 1 in a million chance of having a bad reaction to the vaccine, but nothing seems to be coming up later that's problematic. And the protein specifically, the mRNA does go into our cell, and it provides an instruction sheet to tell our cell how to make spike proteins. These are the proteins that are usually on the outside of the virus. But your cells are making proteins all the time. That's part of how our body functions, is we have to create proteins to do all sorts of normal body functions. And those proteins do their job, they get broken down, they disappear, and that's the same here. These proteins are not the virus. They can't make you sick. They are produced temporarily. Your body sees them as something foreign and starts an immune response. And then the proteins get broken down and they disappear from your body. So at no point do they stick around. The mRNA doesn't even go into the part of your cell where your DNA is, in the nucleus. So it's not even going where the DNA is. So it seems so far, I know this is a new vaccine. We don't have 10 years of experience with it, but we do have decades of experience with other vaccines, and just don't see the kind of surprise effects later on in life happening with any of them. And the immune response here is the same. So we do expect that we'll see the same reassuring picture 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And what we do know is that COVID can have long-lasting effects. Some people end up with serious lung damage that causes them to be unwell for a long time. Some of the people in wave 1, where it was a year ago, who ended up in the ICU are still suffering from problems with their liver or their kidney. They may even have brain damage because they weren't getting enough oxygen. So this is something that we worry about a lot, but not with the vaccine.
The next question I want to pose to you, Dr. Reimer, is one that we see from both ends of the spectrum. So on the one hand, there's many people now, thankfully, in our communities who have been able to receive 2 doses of the vaccine. They're fully vaccinated. And there's some frustration. It's like, well, if I'm fully vaccinated, why can't I visit my kids or my grandkids or go out to grab a bite to eat? And they've done what has been asked of them, and they're not seeing any freedom as vaccinated people. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are those who are most likely planning to never get vaccinated. And they are concerned that those who do take this step will get special privileges that they will not have, and they might be even penalized for choosing not to get vaccinated. So what would you say to the province's plans in their short-term and maybe even the long-term future about how people who make the decision to get vaccinated, what freedom will they enjoy? And if those decide not to get vaccinated, will there be any hindrances to their involvement going forward?
Yeah, and you really highlighted the crux of the problem there, because we do want people to be able to get back to more normal interactions, and that is the whole point of the vaccine. But we also don't want to coerce people. We don't want to force people. We don't want to punish people. We do want people to make their own decisions for their own life and their own health and their own bodies. And so that is absolutely the challenge. So I know the province is trying to walk that line carefully. And I think there will be some privileges that people who are vaccinated will get to go back to sooner. So it's not like permanently you won't be able to socialize or anything like that. But I think the province is going to start to change some of the rules for people who are vaccinated sooner than those who are not vaccinated. But I don't actually know yet what exactly they're going to do. The only examples we've seen so far is that you don't have to self-isolate if you're a close contact, if you've received both doses. And we had the 500, 1,000 as of tonight, folks that went to the Jets game who were fully vaccinated. So, you know, we've got those two examples that have happened so far, and there may be more, but there's a lot of very challenging discussions about, you know, human rights, but also about transmission and about encouraging vaccine, all of these things happening at the same time. One thing I can say for sure is that there will be implications for travel, because we've already seen other countries have put in some new rules. So even if in Manitoba we decided not to do anything special related to whether or not you're vaccinated, there are many countries that are already saying you're going to have to be vaccinated to travel to that country, and we won't have any control over that. So what we want to do is provide Manitobans with the vaccine and with proof of the vaccine so that they're not disadvantaged if other countries come up with those rules, because they have and they will. So that's what we know for sure. But yeah, that is a tough fine line. So we're talking about in Manitoba things like, should we change visitation rules at hospitals and personal care homes based on vaccine status? You know, should we change group sizes based on vaccine status? Should we change whether or not you have to isolate after travel when you're coming back into the province based on vaccine status? So I can't promise that any of those will or won't be enacted, but those are the discussions happening at the provincial level right now.
So right now in the United States, they seem to be opening up and to capacity at sporting events, people sitting side by side without masks. The question is, why are they experiencing freedom where we are not? And it seems to be maybe not getting worse, but not getting better, and maybe Manitoba specifically. Why is that occurring in the States? And are there more ICU beds in the States? They have greater capacity. They're just okay with paying the price of opening up restrictions. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, there's a really big cultural difference between Canada and the US on many different ideals. So both countries think that individual freedom is important, and both countries think that, you know, the wellness of our communities is important. But there's a pretty big difference in how we balance those two against each other. So in Canada, we have a long history of putting the health and well-being of our communities as a top priority. So we have a publicly funded healthcare system because we think it's important that we as a community all together make sure that we're taking care of each other. The US doesn't have a publicly funded healthcare system that provides care to all citizens because they have a different blend of the freedom versus community care than we do. So the US has had a lot more deaths than Canada has related to COVID. And they are more comfortable with that balance. Canada has felt that protecting people, preventing them from ending up in the hospital, stopping loved ones from dying is a higher priority than the personal freedom in some cases. Certainly the balance tilts more in Canada towards, you know, us protecting each other, and more towards the individual decision-making in the US. And neither of those ideals is right or wrong or better or worse. But it is a bit about how the politics plays out in the two different countries, leading to different outcomes. But there's no question that the decisions in the States has led to a lot more illness, a lot more hospitalization, a lot more death. And so some people may feel like that's worth it. And I'm not trying to argue one way or the other, but whether that's worth it to not have to have these public health restrictions. And other people feel like that's not worth it, and we need to make sure we all follow restrictions so we don't see the same number of deaths. And that's tricky, and we're never going to all agree either. Even, you know, within a small town, you're going to get people who have polar opposite views on those two important values, and which one should take priority over the other. So, you know, we continue to see that the US is less restrictive than us, and we continue to see that the price for that is more people being sick.
Is there a percentage that Manitoba is looking for to open up restrictions? A percentage of vaccinated people?
Yeah, so we had some pretty good percentages for the original type of the virus. The variants are making that trickier because they spread more easily. So we originally were saying we wanted 70% of the population vaccinated because we felt like it would be really hard for the virus to take hold if that percentage of the total population was vaccinated. With these variants, we're now talking like we might need 75, maybe 80%. And that's 75 or 80% of the whole population. We only can vaccinate people who are 12 plus right now. So that means we're going to have to hit for sure 80% of the 12 plus, maybe more like 85% of the 12 plus before we truly create a situation where the virus can't survive in our communities. So I think that I know Dr. Rusin and the rest of the public health team are trying to work through the numbers and figure out, what's achievable, because we don't want to set ourselves up to fail either. What's achievable and what's going to actually prevent viral transmission. We can't set impossible goals. We can't say 100% because we'll never get rid of these restrictions. But we also want to set a goal that's actually going to help us stay safe and healthy.
Excellent. Well, I have just learned a ton over the short amount of time. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Reimer, not just for giving your time, but for your transparency, your honesty, with giving some great information and also sharing a little bit of the heart behind some of these restrictions, the heart behind your desire to see people get vaccinated, just to know that this is born out of this desire to see people safe and healthy, this desire for people to do what we can to show love to one another. And I can really appreciate that just as well as all the new things that I learned information-wise. And thank you again, Gerald, for joining and for bringing some of these good questions forward. And I hope that we can all go from here and take this information and also pass it on to others who still may be deciding whether or not the vaccine is right for them.
I really appreciate both of you taking this time and clear how much you care about your communities. And I think all of us and everybody in the community can agree that we want to get out of this and we want to be healthy, and all of us want the best for ourselves, our families, and our communities. So I just really appreciate you meeting with me and everyone who's watching or listening for taking the time to think through this carefully and to try to make the best decisions for you, your family, and your community.
Thank you.
Thanks.